Hello, everybody. How are you? You guys good? Yeah? Okay. So, welcome.
Thank-
Thank you for visiting with us today.
It's always a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
I I just wanted to share with you because I've been thinking about our talk, and I've seen you speak many different times, and I've watched you on many different videos and things, and I just wanted to say that I find you to be a very humble person, a very wise, intelligent person. I find you to be a very empathetic person from what I've seen of you, and I just want to say I appreciate the person that you are in your role, uh, that you play in such an important role in crypto, and the person that you bring to this community. So I wanted to just say thank you for that.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
So I thought that one thing that was interesting in some of the conversations that I've seen you talking was kind of your upbringing and your background, right? It's kind of a unique kind of place to be. I thought maybe you could share a little bit about that with the audience here.
Sure. I mean, I'm Chinese, but I actually was born and raised in Austria in the 70s. So I've been around the block. And what was also interesting about being growing up in the 70s and the 80s in Austria was that it was right at the border of what used to be essentially Western Europe and Eastern Europe. So we still essentially had the Iron Curtain. And for those of you who might be too young to even know what that was basically when Europe, half of Europe was basically communist. I know a lot of people could today compare socialism to communism if you've not seen communism. My mom used to work at the Komische Oper on the eastern side of Berlin, and I would visit her. And she's an artist, originally an opera singer and then opera director, and I would see what it was like. So that definitely shaped my experience. And then, of course, the other thing is that I studied music. That was my first degree, and that also sort of shaped my experiences in terms of seeing the creative industries as well and seeing what happens. Because maybe just to fast forward a little bit before I got into tech, artists around the world were constantly being taken advantage of. And this is a realization I just made much later on because they knew nothing about money, right? And you see this. So they tell an agent to do the stuff. And by the way, the biggest agent for music today is Spotify, right? And we may not call them an agent, but effectively they place the role of that agent and they extract. Because the other thing that I also realized after seeing what happened in essentially, a basically socially democratic place that had let's call it tamed form of capitalism, experiencing absolute extreme form of socialism and communism, then going to America when I was working for Atari, experiencing capitalism, then coming to Hong Kong, which at the time when I went to Hong Kong in the in the 90s had no social security, was Milton Friedman's wet dream, and basically basically capitalism overdrive. So I've seen that entire cycle, and it kind of sort of shaped some of the thinking around money in the sense that if you don't have financial literacy, you'll always get taken advantage of because money is a new form of power. But that was something that in my generation, we never spoke of money as power. But today, with the explosion of the basically minority of people that have so much wealth relative to others, you can see how that you can see it also play out in American politics as well, where money is very much a proxy for power, and maybe historically has always been, but we haven't really had a way to, and maybe just to sort of, if you are able to sort of, when we talk about decentralization, the power of decentralization, which is what attracted me to blockchain, is around decentralization of power. So if more people, for instance, sure, you might have a few whales in Bitcoin, but the fact that Bitcoin is fairly distributed across large swaths of people is the reason why that network can stay decentralized. It's not because someone has more mining power. It's the fact that the economic power that sits is reasonably distributed and people can band together, right? And when you have an oligarchic system or when you have a system where one has all the money, then they have all the power. And then essentially you go back to a feudal system of sorts.
What instrument were you playing?
Piano, flute, and cello.
Uh,
Yeah, that was a long time ago. Yes.
you still play it now?
Yeah, I mean, so playing music was not my passion. It was my mom's passion for me. Because she was a professional musician, and she's Chinese, so Asian tiger parenting, everything. So I was forced to go through that. But I think also now that I'm a parent of my own myself, I realized that was just her way of, I guess you just when parents tiger parent you, it's their way of showing love, even though it's more traumatic,
Right.
right? Um, and it took me maybe 20 years to get out of that when I had my own kids. And when I realized that, because she's an immigrant, and that's the other thing. When you're an immigrant, you're coming into a new country as a foreigner. And, like there's not a lot of Chinese people in Austria. There were far less back then, right? And so it was all about integrating. It was all about, and how could she protect me theoretically? Well, I should do a job that she understands, right? And that, by the way, isn't true anymore as well. Like the jobs our kids will be doing are going to be completely different jobs. We can't even imagine what they might be. But back then, it was very normal for a parent to assume, if you're a farmer, your child's going to be a farmer. If you're an accountant, you would be an accountant. If you're a doctor, you're a doctor. My mom was an artist, so maybe I should be an artist, right? And it came from the lens of also, I can teach you, I can help you. This is not true anymore in the same way, right? So I think the skills now are much more human skills as opposed to, let's call it, sort of mechanical skills.
So this underlying theme of having an understanding of being in an artistic community and being involved in that kind of upbringing of seeing all of these different cultures and different ways of living has really driven your view around business.
It has, but it's also made me, I think, appreciate the value of cultural capital. Perhaps that maybe if you start from finance first, you might not appreciate the same way. Right. So when you think of, if you're in the 1 or 2 percentile of people who start with money, as in you're in banking and finance, then you look at everything in fairly economic terms. But most of the world does not look at it in economic terms, right? There's value, but it's not looked at in a money sense. And you see it more amplified in places like, for instance, Europe and also Japan. So the attitude in Japan about money is very different than it is, say, for instance, in Hong Kong or in New York, in those financial centers. So that means that the way you treat people, the power you have, isn't only based on money. For instance, in Japan, you might give a lot of credit and reputation to someone who has great craft and great ability, but it doesn't have to be the richest person in the world, kind of thing, right? Whereas in other societies, your balance sheet is actually more of an equivalent of power and deference than maybe your craft. And that has a lot, but most people would gravitate towards and respect the craft, as it were, right? And I think that's another element where even the people who have wealth eventually want to create symbolic and cultural capital to represent that. Right. So, for instance, if someone is a millionaire, there's no differentiation between a 1 millionaire, 5 millionaire, or 10 millionaire, or even 100 millionaire. And we recognize that someone who has 100 million has more money and arguably power than the one who has 5 million. However, he's still called a millionaire. Go from millionaire to billionaire. What do? Well, they buy art, they choose to live in a certain place, they give to philanthropy. So the distinction becomes more. And what do they care about is their reputation and their social standing, right? So it's social currency. And money is actually really, I would say, a social currency. So we understand money as a social currency. It's what glues people together. The fact that I can do business with you, begin a transaction. So we also believe that humans are, transactional in every way. It could be transactional in a relational way, but it's still a transaction. And money introduces that transaction. So maybe I don't know about Japan, but for instance, in Hong Kong or in US, it's very normal to make friendships through business. How do you start it? Well, I want to sell you something. And maybe it's just a transaction, but then I begin a relationship. It's like the I don't know, like the communication starter, right? The icebreaker of a relationship. And money has done this to the world and is probably still the largest social communication platform of sorts.
So what do you think that the blockchain environment can do to facilitate the enhancement of society, across that? Since you've seen,
yeah, there's so many. So I don't think we have enough time to go over all of them. But maybe I would focus on a few things. So the very first thing I would say is that, how we got into the space is that it's very difficult. Like we live in capitalism, we live in a capitalist world, and yet the majority of our society is not actually capitalist. And by that, I don't mean that you live in a capitalist space, but you don't own capital. And I think Japan's a great example of that. Most of the people here still live in a labor economy. They work for the money, and that's okay, but they don't invest. And I think the global statistics of people who actually have an investment portfolio is under 10% in the world. So the people who have investments, if you look at the increasement of capital versus labor, clearly capital has done this. Labor has done actually this. And the reason it's done this is because of money printing, because of inflation, right? Wages aren't going accelerating the way that capital has gone up. But if you were actually a capitalist and you understood investing in money, you would have been investing the first money you would have made, even if it was a small amount, to participate in that growth, right? So what we need to do is bring more people into the world of capital, which means that they have to become property owners, right? The basis of capitalism starts with owning some form of property. But what property can they own that can be something that we all participate in? And that's basically digital assets. So it's harder for someone, we have this in Hong Kong or London or New York or even Tokyo, like for a young person to own land, which is the classic form of property that people think of. It's impossible. And in the arc of history, every time that you want to solve for that problem, you have revolution, land redistribution, right? You just look at that over time, right? So what is that type of land as a metaphor that we can give to people that is actually valuable? And that's basically digital assets. And the conclusion we came to is we spend most of our time online. We're mostly virtual. The value that is generated from virtual real estate in the form of advertising alone is about $1 trillion a year and is owned by about 5 or 6 companies. Right, 5 or 6. Well, I mean, Google, Meta, Facebook, those types, right? That's actually what they own, right? So if you can actually distribute that, but not in a socialist way, just in a way of how can I own a stake in it? So we can't own a stake in the networks that we participate in, and blockchain is a way to do that, right? So you can, so that's kind of one example of that. But the other thing you can do is you can actually now intellectually. So I go back to this other form of property that is virtual, that we can't hold, because the criticism is, but it's virtual, it's not physical. The largest growth in capital has been in intellectual property. Intellectual property today is a $68 trillion market, which is anywhere from 8 to 10 times gold. All right, so it's more valuable than gold. And that's entirely based on virtual conduct, a product. But the reason why it can exist is because it's something you can now protect. So there's a legal system that protects your intellectual property, trade secrets, patents, whatever. And so you can build a property right on it. And then an artist, like if you didn't have property rights for music, you wouldn't have Taylor Swift, you wouldn't have the Beatles, you wouldn't have Michael Jackson, you wouldn't have the movie industry, right? It wouldn't be possible, right? And that innovation really started about 400 or 500 years ago with the Statute of Anne, where they were for the first time creating a copyright framework for books, because people used to write books that were printed, but the author didn't have copyright protection. So he wasn't able to generate money from that, and then someone would just rip it off, right? And so that law allowed them to do this. So they established property rights around this, and then from that, wealth creation was possible. So the problem, though, with that framework is that it costs money in the current system to create intellectual property rights. You need a lawyer, you need conveyancing, you need that stuff. So unless you make $50,000 to $100,000 a year on this product, or you think you will, it's not worth making a $20,000, $30,000 minimum investment to do that, right? So there is a cap on what you can protect intellectually. But with blockchain, you can basically create a frame of ownership of original creation at basically $1, which I think is even more relevant in the age of AI, where AI is basically taking all sorts of data from everyone and is not giving any attribution, right? I mean, you use ChatGPT, you might get a link, but actually it should give you attribution directly as to who it got the source from. And through blockchain, you could give it a reward as well when you do that. So I'll give you some esoteric examples, but it's interesting. For instance, teachers in Venezuela can start making content. They can create intellectual property protection on it through the blockchain. They might only make $10 a year, but then someone might be buying it for a 10 or 20% yield. So they'll buy it for $50 to $100, which is basically the foundation of IP rights and the foundation of real estate, right? Like, remember, our real estate cost was not as expensive as it is today, right? So it developed over time because of the demand that came from those type of property rights. So you extend that. Or we have another portfolio company that is, again, funny one, where they basically were protecting their dance moves, right? And it sounds very strange to protect your dance moves, but
some are good,
right? No, some are good, but the inspiration of the story of this company called Dance Fight was that the dancer had his moves stolen by Fortnite. And he played Fortnite and he saw his dance move And he's like, wait, that's my move. I invented, I created that. And then he, of course, sort of messaged Epic, and he got nothing, of course, because not only could he not prove it, there was no legal system around it or anything to do that. The blockchain would solve that. So you can see how that framework can essentially create an intellectual property and a protection of property rights all over that the blockchain can enable, not just through virtual digital assets. And the final point I'll say is, and that's why I said it's a big topic, there's a lot more to say about this, is that there's a new kind of asset that has come into existing, and that's the networked asset. This asset didn't exist before, wasn't possible through tokens. So that means that if I own something like Ethereum, I'm not only owning something that is buildable and composable, I'm owning a part of a network which I get value from when I participate in that network. And every token's the same, even a meme coin, whether it's worth a lot or worth little. When I own the token, I'm actually now a member of that network, and I can take advantage and benefit from that. Right? I become a member of this network asset. And this asset class didn't exist before blockchain came about. And it's powerful because everything in the world is a network effect. Even us here in this room is a network effect that we couldn't enumerate before. But through tokens and blockchain, now there is a value that you can attest to, whether it's worth a lot or little. Your friendship circle, your company, right? So meaning that if Instagram, as an example, were to be tokenized, the value of the token of that network of Instagram would be multiple times that what perhaps its value would be inside Facebook, because the only value there is how much I can extract from it from advertising. It doesn't give you the benefit of the value of that network, right? The old world example I give is kind of like a shopping mall, right? You own a shopping mall, you can get rent, but you don't own the network effects of all the businesses that are within it, right? And a token can enumerate that. And the digital world is all about networks.
Do you think we see that? And do you think we see a distribution of these social networks and the ownership of
Yes.
on a Web3 basis?
So I think social networks are being totally disrupted, but in a different way. People think of a social network in the concept of a product like Facebook or Instagram, and that's one way to express it. But every token is a social network. The first framing, though, is money. So I come in because of money. But then later on, I have relations and see how tribal people are on Bitcoin, right? I mean, I don't need to know, for instance, whether, how much Bitcoin you have, but I can prove you have a Bitcoin, I have a Bitcoin, you have a Bitcoin. Then we're all part of the network. And you can see how that connection comes from the fact that we have now something at stake, right? As opposed to, pretending, right? Which is the other thing in social media. We try to fake our status. We pay for Instagram likes, right? We bought basically follows because we want to have a certain number of status to prove it, as opposed to something that you would be totally provable on blockchain. So I would argue every token is essentially a network and is a form of a social network. NFTs maybe are more defined, but they're all forms of these networks that maybe you need systems to organize. And so the powerful thing about L1 and L2s is that they create this social platform, and then people self-organize with applications and software on top. So Ethereum in itself isn't what is a social network, and then people build applications on top of Ethereum to create essentially that framing and create those networks and products. Not that dissimilar from Facebook having an API, except the difference is that every developer owns a piece of it, as opposed to here, Facebook owns everything and all the value is generated from it, which is obviously not a good deal.
And on this, the ownership of the asset side and owning everything, do you think that the core of this comes from the gaming background? Am I right? Because in the gaming world, everything could be for sale inside of the game, right? Everybody could own something, and that's on the most root level could be the start of this conversation that you're having. And it's an easy way for people to own a certain type of weapon or a certain type of shield or something of the sort. And that could be the beginning of this vision that you're having of property rights across the world.
So I think the reason why property rights or ownership works is because innately, I think all humans desire it. Right. It's a reason why capitalism has won over communism, for example, because communism is all about the abolishment of property rights in the name of equality, right? That's the idea. But it turns out that you can't, because humans want property rights. They want to own, and they want to own a stake in something. And I would argue the very first form of ownership that we have as humans is our own name. So if you think about the history, in the arc of human history, most of us, if you look just, 500 or 1,000 years ago, didn't have a last name, right? That's why your last name might be related to the city you're in or the profession you're in, right? So we owned our first name and our last name And that was the beginning of our journey. We own ourselves first, away from slavery and feudalism, then into basically areas of, well, what else can I own? I own this house, I own this property, I own this thing, and then build a foundation from it. So you didn't need someone to establish the framework. Innately, we wanted to have ownership of this. Like that's something that we want and need, right? So the digital framework on gaming makes sense. But I look at gaming almost more like a skeuomorphic form of digital asset conversion. So meaning that's not about teaching people about ownership. I think we all want ownership. It's just more like it's easy to tell a gamer why virtual currency has value in the form of a token, and why, gaming skins, which you value, could be NFTs as a form of property right. Like a gamer thinks he owns that already. So it's an easy transition form. But in the future, we don't think it's about that. Like it's much more broader than that. It's just an easy way to onboard. And so we're using these interfaces because a gamer can understand that, right? So I say it's kind of skeuomorphic, but it's not the endpoint.
So many companies have tried to do this ownership of data, of your own data, right? And it seems like it's a tough one for the market to grab onto. While it seems like it would be the best one for the consumer to grab onto because everybody has so much data, but nobody's really succeeded at that yet. What do you think the challenge there is?
So I think the challenge is because we don't understand how data works, and that the most valuable thing from data isn't your data, but it's what your data derives. And I think there's an interesting example with Instagram, where in Europe, because of privacy laws, they're forcing you to say, if you don't want your data to be shared, then you have to pay, I think it's 8 or 9 euros a month, right? So that's an easy translation. It's probably already discounted. Easy translation as to your data, at least for Facebook, is worth something like $100, right? But that's only what you post over there, right? But the real value is the derivative that comes from it, and the ultimate value is you as a customer, right? So how do I translate this? Well, we spend $1 trillion in advertising today. For what purpose? To acquire a customer, right? Who gets that money? Not the customer. That money goes to the platform that supposedly finds you, right? Whether it's Apple, Facebook, Google, whatever, right? But the profile that I find you as a customer is what? It's your data, right? It's where you go, where you live, how much money you make. And so I'm targeted as that. Now, we've been looking at it the wrong way. We've been looking at, what does my data generate? But that's not the point, at least in this example. In this example, the point is the derivative of the data is what you're worth to someone else, right? Whether it's a platform that wants to use your data to create an algorithm, or whether it's a company that wants to acquire you as a customer, right? So if you are, for instance, someone who has the ability to buy a Lamborghini, right? Since we're in crypto, let's talk about Lambos, right?
Yeah.
Right? You're worth a lot, right? And how do we get them in the traditional world? We throw gala parties. We spend thousands of dollars, if not tens of thousands of dollars, to try to acquire someone who'll spend $1 million item, or a Christie's or the Sotheby's, that kind of stuff, right? And if you're lower down the food chain, maybe then I'll spend $50. Like, how much do credit card companies pay to acquire a customer to become their credit card customer? For instance, anywhere from $50 to $100, sometimes $250 per customer you acquire. In gaming, the average cost of a paid user is over $80 US for lifetime value, right? $80, right? Now imagine this gamer doesn't play one game. He plays 10, 20, 30 games a year, right? So you add that up, if he pays and spends money in that game, just for the gaming industry, he's worth hundreds of dollars, maybe $500. Add up every aspect in which you're being targeted in advertising, you're worth thousands, if not tens of thousands of dollars, right? Now, there's nothing wrong with an intermediary getting a fee, but they get 100% of the fee, right? That's what your data is worth. But of course, media executives don't talk about that because they don't want you to think about advertising as data that should be paid to you. They think of it as data as, but your photos can be used for face recognition and for tagging, and that's de minimis in value, right? And that is a value, but it's small. It's the advertising industry. That $1 trillion ought to be an asset that is owned by most of the world because you're the target, right? Now, this is what happens with airdrops. So in the last 4 years, over close to $50 billion worth of airdrops was given basically from platforms and from token platforms and gaming and L1, L2s. And you might say this is like a lot of money that you're just giving out, but it's really just the inverse of advertising. I'm giving you a token, whether it's $50, $100, or $1,000, in so that you can use it in my platform, or you're engaging, you're creating promotion. So you really, what you're doing is you're paying people to come to your platform. But how is that different from paying advertising? Not different at all. And then they create noise and create more network effects that come from that, right? But the difference is that when you give money to a user, a real user, not a bot, that's a different story, but a real user, the chances of that user reinvesting it in your ecosystem or spending money on it is infinitely higher. Because, for instance, in the gaming industry, how much does Google, Apple, or Facebook put back in the gaming industry? Zero. How much money does a gamer that is advertised from these platforms get in value from advertising? Zero, right? So, but if you pay the gamer directly, he will put it back into the game, and even if it's only 10 or 20%, that gamer will have had made a certain amount of money that he will put into another game, right? And you see this with stimulus funding. When the government is basically giving free money, so to speak, to everyone, do people put it in the savings account? They spend, right? Because of mental accounting. So they spend it on, I don't know, a bag, or they go to a fancy restaurant, or they do stuff, which is the whole point. That's why it works. And exactly the same thing with tokens, which is, and it recycles. And that's the power. And I think, therefore, it's an inevitable train, because once that cycle begins, you can't stop it.
So how do we transition people? Because this data thing has been a little bit of a challenge, right? For me, it sounds very logical that everybody should own their own data and there should be ecosystems to allow us to do that. What's the first thing that could transition the people that aren't sitting here in this environment, just the regular audience, to start owning property rights? Like, what do you envision as the base level?
So there are two major hurdles on any kind of property rights, including digital property rights, I think we need to overcome. But the very first one is financial literacy. So most of the world is not financially literate. Now, I don't mean to say that they don't have access to financial tools like a bank account. I think there's a misnomer to think that just because I'm banked, I have financial literacy. As I said earlier, the global population, the number of people that actually have any kind of investment portfolio is under 10%, right? And some places like US is higher, like maybe 40 or 50%. But still, half of Americans don't have an investment portfolio. I mean, that's wild that essentially the center of capitalism, ostensibly, has a huge percentage of the population that doesn't invest, that isn't involved in the capital market, right? So you need to have that understanding first, because then you can look at everything from the lens of investing. I understand that, oh, okay, I need to, this time is worth something, right? Therefore, I should be paid or have value for that. So it starts with that thinking first. Then the second one is it should be something that interests you. So we've seen this like with gaming, for instance, what you saw with Axie Infinity, and it's coming back, right? What's interesting about that platform is that people in the Philippines who never had a bank account because they couldn't, which is $5 or $10 a month, now had a crypto wallet, could be financially banked through essentially an activity that they might have enjoyed, like playing a game, and then ended up learning about money. And I think the disconnection often has been around, okay, I can onboard you with an easier MetaMask or like a more straightforward approach or make it invisible. But they need to understand why. And the why starts with financial literacy. So our hurdle is, how do we make people more financially literate? Which is why if you're in the finance world, it's easier for you to roll into crypto. Which is why when you're in Hong Kong or New York or London, it's easier for you to get in crypto because every person is already thinking financially. But if you go to Europe, right, like Germany, for instance, most people don't even think about it. And frankly, I think Japan has some of that problem because a lot of people here, again, are not financially literate. They have money, but they're not financially literate. They don't understand inflation. They don't have to worry about it. They don't have an investment portfolio. All right, so we have to begin with that. And I think gaming is a way of educating it. So it's storytelling, right? So if you basically teach people about that, then I think you have a better chance of onboarding them. So I think that's the key thing. And so when you create a game or an application or you gamify it, then you make it fun, you make it easy to understand, and you learn, and then you basically go through the journey. I think that's the important part. It's not making it simple. It's around educating the user into the world of money.
So I know we don't have much time left, so I want to get kind of a uh, question about kind of where you see things going now in in crypto. Lots of financing is changing inside the crypto world, right? Not as much ICOs happening as there is public market, centralized finance kind of things happening, right? Seems like a lot of money is being put into the markets there. Where do you see kind of like this next phase of decentralization and finance going?
So a couple of things. First, it may not be in the form of the ICO, but the launch of tokens is bigger and faster than ever before, right? And the mental model to think about token launches for most of them is a little bit like launching websites, right? So if you remember back in the 90s, the number of websites we had were in the thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands. And today, they're in the billions. And I say billions not because we have a billion websites in the old way, like HTTP, but billions because every Instagram profile, every Facebook profile, every TikTok page is essentially a new kind of website, right? It's basically a web presence that focuses on attention. And that will be demonstrated in the form of a token, whether it has like Mr. Beast style sort of following, or whether it has like, I don't know, like only 5,000 or 1,000 type following, right? And when you saw the launch of the Kanye token, right, for instance, which we can say, oh, it's a meme coin, whatever. The value of the Kanye token or the Trump token, meme as it is representative of the network effect and the network value that is representative with that community. Of course, there are services that have to come to it if it wants to enhance it, but that's essentially what that market framing is like, right? So, and it's, what is it? Kanye's market cap token, regardless of whether you like it or not, is what, 700, $800 million, right? So that to me doesn't sound ridiculous given Kanye's brand, right? Even though some people say it should be worth more or less, whatever that may be, right? So what comes next? Well, in a world where you have mass tokenization of everything, what are the assets that you can mass onboard people? And that's why so many people focus on RWAs. When you think of stable coins as the initial Genesis RWA, if you will, that has really probably the best product market fit, it's easy for someone to understand that their physical dollar could now become a virtual dollar if it's backed one-to-one. Very easy, right? Even if it's not the endpoint for crypto, it's an easy onboarder, right? And that's why people are now looking at real estate, or in our case, we're looking at, for instance, tokenizing student loans. Again, it's easy for people to understand, oh, I tokenize a student loan, I can sell it on to someone else, but also the student then basically receives a loan through crypto. He has a wallet. He learns about money. He gets onboarded, right? These are all elements around that, but it starts with something that you already do and understand, which is why gaming is interesting, because I'm already playing a game. So it's easy for me to understand. The difference, though, is that it's not, it's a new game. So that's why the hurdle is a bit more challenging, because you have to excite people to try a new game, as opposed to if it was an existing game, right? And which, by the way, next year we think is going to be interesting because of the launch of GTA 6. And GTA 6 is going to be the biggest game launch ever in the history of games, much anticipated. But the key is not that sort of Take-Two is going to launch their own token. The fact that the US has now opened up towards it means that there's no reason anymore to block tokens, which is before what all these game companies used to do. But they allow this thing called RP service, roleplay service, where you can run your own server. And so you can imagine that many of those game platforms that have these UGC servers are going to be running crypto rails on these servers, and that would be a form of that kind of adoption. So we look at that, RWAs, of course, and then you talked about treasury companies. So this is the distinction between, you have a billion tokens out there. How do I know which are the tokens that I should be focusing on, right? Well, it's going to be the ones that have institutional appeal. And that's why treasury companies are important, because treasury companies are that next level of institutional certification, right? So you can't audit an L1, L2 on their accounts. That doesn't work. How do you audit Ethereum, right? Doesn't work, right? But you can audit the ownership of the asset by a firm. And if certain executives and people you trust, that essentially is running in a public company framework, then you can trust the asset itself, which doesn't just help the public company, it also helps the asset underlying, because it gives that institutional appeal. Which means we're getting back down to an area where, ironically, the public markets gives you the credibility, as it has done with essentially private companies going public. And now you have essentially with tokens going public, as it were, right? Because you're already public as a token, but now you're going institutionally public. And so you'll need that beyond ETFs, right? And so this will be the difference between, let's call it the multi-billion-dollar asset classes, which are going to be public, and most of the other token ecosystems that are going to be valuable, like an SME. Nothing wrong with a multi-million-dollar token ecosystem. It's good for business, but it's not necessarily ready to be public as an IPO in the same way that we see with treasury companies of the bigger tokens that are out there.
So do you think there's the convergence that's happening right now is just a natural evolution, is what you're
It
saying?
is. It's a natural evolution, and we think it's also a natural evolution for it to move into alts as well, right? Because the alt space is the area where you have utility. So Bitcoin is a store of value, that's clear. And I don't think there's any competition around that. But when you start making money, you also want to use it and apply it somewhere. And when you have a token that basically ends up being a treasury business, you might just own it as an asset, but then you learn about it. Like how many people bought Bitcoin because, oh, I think it's a good investment, knowing very little about it. And then they started learning about the technology. And then they started saying, oh, that's interesting. And it goes back to the very first question talked about, like the principles of ownership. When you own something, you become a fan of it, right? Because you have something at stake, right? Versus some invisible like that maybe there's a few thousand who are great fans, but most of them just like you for polite reasons or because they just react to it, but has no actual reaction to it, right? Whereas if you own something, then you actually are invested in it. And when you're invested in it, and you go deeper, right? And so this is the point. Once you invested in a company that has a certain asset, you start learning about it, right? You don't just, like how many people might have even bought Tesla or something because, hey, it's Elon Musk, but I don't know anything about Tesla. And then they started looking into it and understanding about, it's not just about cars, it's about power, it's about sustainable power, and so on, right? So the education journey begins when you have something at stake, when you have some feeling or emotion to it.
So almost like a Trojan horse the opposite way, right? It's like,
Right.
okay, we did all these token launches, everything got launched. We built an audience around that. It's a community of people that are around that. But now it's time to expand, and it's time to bring in other people to understand the property right ownership of those particular tokens. So maybe this is just an opposite way of bringing in a much broader audience into that ownership. And so
Absolutely.
it could be very helpful for the community.
I think the acceleration of that is also visible because the people who buy those stocks are already very financially literate. So they understand money, they understand investing. So it's very natural for them to do the analysis that goes down. Like right now, when someone is investing in a treasury company, you're not just looking at, oh, this is an interesting stock with an interesting token. You want to understand the token, right? You don't just make a blind decision to buy into that because that audience is already financially literate. So, we're talking about onboarding billions of people, but there are, 100 or so, 200 so million people that are in the financial world that haven't been onboarded yet, right? There's 500 million people who own crypto, but maybe only 10% of that are on chain, right? And the whole goal is to bring them on chain. And that would be the way to do that.
Step one. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate you being with us here today and taking the time to visit. So we welcome you back anytime to the DNA House. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.